Singapore's style of socialism has been most evident in its approach to housing. The leaders of the country were heavily influenced by the British welfare state and its ability to clear slums and provide modern, affordable homes. They wanted the same for Singapore.
The families, which had once lived in slums, now had private entrances, glass windows, piped water, gas and electricity.
The government embarked on a massive public building program, creating huge estates across the island, rehousing the vast majority of the population. But there was always a fundamental difference between the Singaporean and British approach. Instead of renting out apartments, people were encouraged to buy them. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to avoid the sort of dependency culture he had seen emerging in Britain.
We started selling a few blocks. He said, this is yours. You pay it by installment over 20 years. And we could see the stark difference between a owner-occupied high-rise and a rented high-rise. One was cared after, looked after, precious because it's theirs. The other just declines. So we decided that we'll give everybody a chance to own their own home.
Ironically, this approach to social housing would eventually find its way back to Britain when Margaret Thatcher came to power. She'd been a long-time admirer of Lee Kuan Yew and, inspired by the Singaporean model, encouraged tenants to buy their own homes. Few people in Britain realized the policy had been copied from Singapore. Today, 80% of Singapore's population live in apartments built by the state but owned privately.
One of the reasons why so many people can afford to buy the flat rather than rent is because of a financing mechanism that is interesting. We have a compulsory social security savings. So every employee in Singapore must save 20% of their income with a proportional contribution from the employer. And the government then loans some of that money to the housing board. So the housing board builds the housing, sells it to the Singaporean, right? And then the Singaporean uses their savings to pay for mortgage.
Their savings become kind of a grant.
It's like, I'm a worker, I save money, right, in my compulsory savings fund. I buy a house from the housing board. I pay my monthly mortgage from my savings. And so it's just a closed circuit of transfer.
What percentage of the Singaporean income is used on housing monthly?
That actually is a very interesting question. You don't see how much you pay because it's all in the transfer, right? Once you sign to buy and pay mortgage, a lot of Singaporeans actually doesn't know how much they pay for housing. But it is generally said to be below 25%.
Singaporeans have access to housing to match their income. For those with better means, there is the Pinnacle, the largest social housing project in the world. This enormous complex of 1,848 units on 51 floors has the largest roof garden in the world, a 3-kilometer exterior jogging trail on the 26th floor, basketball courts, and several family parks. Not exactly the typical social housing project.
Government to physically integrate the population. Right? So if you are in a public housing estate, the 3 major races, Chinese, Malays, and Indians, are mixed together in almost the same proportion of the composition of the national population.
Can you tell me about the range of HDBs? Because in other countries, you could think it would mean low-income housing.
Right. In most countries, you have situations in which all the poor people are grouped into a housing estate, and then fairly quickly the housing estate becomes essentially a slum or a squat, Whereas in Singapore, the houses are mainly sold to the residents for 99 years. So because they are owners, they also put a lot of money into maintenance. Because the government controls the planning of the whole town, the housing for the low income and for the middle class are physically mixed together. If you don't have a trained eye as an architect, you actually can't tell which block is poor, which block is not. And so physically, you don't get a kind of isolation of the poor.
What happens after 99 years?
We don't know, because no building has lasted 99 years yet. But when the HDB does tear down old blocks and build new ones, the tenants who are affected gets a new flat that starts from year 0.